Hey, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sarah Ladislaw. I am the director of the Energy and National Security Program here at CSIS and want to welcome all of you to our event today on electricity, peace, and conflict. Today is a fun event for two reasons. One, we get to have Morgan Bazilian here, who's one of our senior associates and not always in town. Before it was because he was traveling, now it's because he's relocated. So really pleased to have him here today. But also, this is an event that we're doing in honor of St. Patrick's Day, and our guests will talk about some of the events that have been going on around town this week in honor of St. Patrick's Day, but we're holding it on International Pi Day. So March 14th, happy Pi Day to everybody. So we're sort of morphing two holidays into one together. I'm also really pleased to have with us today, for the first time, Bryan O Gallagher, who is a professor of energy engineering at University College Cork, and also runs the UCC's Environmental Research Institute. So Bryan has never been to CSIS before, so we're welcoming him here. You know, when we were thinking about how to structure today's event, it was really to get at sort of two specific things. One is the role that technical issues like electricity can play in solving peace and conflict issues in various parts of the country, world. Morgan is going to talk a little bit about that, and then Professor O Gallachóir is going to talk about the very specific instance and history surrounding how that played a role in Ireland. So I've actually learned a lot from reading their paper and seeing their presentations, so I think it's going to be a great discussion. Before all events, as you all know, just want to do one quick security reminder. We take your security very seriously. I will be your security captain in the event that some sort of an alarm or incident occurs. So please just pay attention to me and we'll make sure that you get out of the building safely. We don't anticipate anything happening, but we do take your safety very seriously. So Morgan Bazilian, the other person I didn't introduce, is a senior associate here at CSIS, but now is the director of the Payne Institute at the Colorado School of Mines. It's the Payne Institute for Earth Resources, and he's a research professor of public policy there as well. He'll tell us maybe a little bit about what the Payne Institute is too. So without further ado, Morgan.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Sarah, for having us. It's always so nice to be here. I think I'm going to show a couple slides and talk for 15 minutes, something like that, and then turn it over to Bryan, and then I guess we can open it. As far as Bryan and I are aware, it's also being webcast, so oh yeah, there's the thumbs up. Hello and welcome. So I think this is going to just naturally work. There's the beautiful picture of, I'm not sure where that is actually. So my name is Morgan Bazilian. I used to be a lead energy specialist at the World Bank for the last 4 years, and I've recently, very recently, relocated to the Colorado School of Mines, which is a small public research university in outside of Denver, Colorado. The university itself has been around since 1874, which is 2 years before Colorado received statehood. It's primarily an engineering and science university with a focus on energy, natural resources, and environment. So almost all of the faculty at the university claim or have some scientific or engineering background in one of those areas. The Payne Institute itself was formulated to take that deep science and engineering understanding and bring it to the formulation of public policy. So it's the first such cross-campus institute at Mines. And one of the early interesting things, just as an aside, that I learned on campus was that there's a fairly robust program at Mines on space resources, which I find terribly exciting because we can do public policy on mining asteroids and the moon. And so I immediately went out and watched the film Armageddon. And because of the fact that Bruce Willis does the mining as the asteroid is moving, I thought it would have an interesting public policy dimension to it. Hi, Adam. So anyway, we're going to get into that, but first we'll start with Earth resources, as they call them. So I'm going to talk about something about the energy transition, such as we discuss it in conversation, and elements of conflict. And there's a lot of different vectors you could take in this discussion. I'm going to look at it from a couple perspectives, then talk about 2 or 3 countries where we've done some research or done some work: Afghanistan, South Sudan, and somewhere else that I'm forgetting. So let's see. So this is now, thanks to Fatih Birol and the IEA, this is now my first slide for all presentations, admittedly. What it says is just, to me, what it says is all the countries in yellow or regions in yellow are growing, and the regions in red, which are essentially the OECD, are not growing. And so the energy story or the energy transition, you could make a fairly solid point that the energy transition is a developing country story. That means demand is growing in those places and investment's growing, where in the OECD that tends not to be the case, or tends to be a different scale. So I just give you that to say that if that's the case, and it certainly looks like it, a lot of those yellow circles are in areas where there is some kind of conflict or fragile or conflict states. And so it became a real focus at the World Bank in the past couple of years, because the IDA funding, or the development funding for the poorest countries, looks to be on the rise. Where the funding for the IBRD, or the middle income emerging economies, looks less like that. And so when you look at those IDA countries, there's a list called the Fragile and Conflict States. FCV is the acronym, Fragile, Conflict, and Violence, maybe, states. There's a list that the World Bank keeps. There's a list someone else keeps. There's a harmonized list. And that list of countries are all IDA countries. And how we invest in the energy infrastructure or the energy systems in these countries is not terribly clear, and it's never easy. And I'll go through that with an example of Afghanistan, where I co-led the energy work for the last couple of years. So coming back out to conflict in general, it's terrible to say interesting in these things. In other words, academics always use the term interesting to describe issues. While these are interesting issues, they're also not so interesting and very hard for the people who actually live there, of course. But I hope you'll bear with me with the term interesting. The slide on, I can't even tell left or right, this one on my right, that comes from a paper that we now have submitted to a journal. It came out as an estimate of the oil production and refining by the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. And what you see there in the red dots is the flares that are seen from what's called the VEERS satellite that NOAA runs. So I just threw out a ton of acronyms there, so we can come back to those. But anyway, a satellite that goes around and looks at global gas flaring. What they're able to do is pinpoint it in the Islamic State's former, this isn't up to date, but pretty close, and where there was flaring, so where there was production sites or refining sites. I just show it so that's one aspect of this energy and conflict, the illegal, as it were, or sale and production of oil. So they took over these oil production sites. And the interesting part there was that the Department of State, and sorry about this digression, but I find it fascinating. So there was the satellite imagery we were able to get, and you make some proxies about what you see versus how much is being produced or refined. And then the State Department released some, I think they're termed interviews, with the head of the former head of the Islamic State oil company. I'm doing this a lot. And we were able to match them with the satellite imagery. In other words, this man who was the head of the oil company for the Islamic State, collaborated, the numbers we were seeing. So that was really interesting. The other one on the right-hand side here is just a screenshot from this really cool company called tankertrackers.com, which, as far as I know, is made up of 3 human beings who sit in London, I believe. And they make use of this satellite imagery, visible imagery primarily, but also some thermal signatures. And they're just doing terrific work, and it's public domain. And every day on Twitter, you can find these unbelievably fascinating pieces about how much oil was brought from the Kurdish Iraq through Turkey to be sent somewhere else, et cetera, et cetera. And they have really interesting data about, Sarah and Adam will know this, but the first very large ship from Saudi that was docked in Louisiana picking up LNG, and the transponder went off for a day and a half or something, and tank trackers picked it up immediately, and fascinating stuff. So so there's new ways to monitor this kind of stuff, and a lot more of it is in the public domain, where it used to be more housed, say, in the last 10 years in the Department of Defense or other places. So when we think of, is that my, yeah. So Bryan O Gallagher here is going to talk about the Irish case, where we looked at different borders, or where we're looking at what happened in a post-conflict Ireland around energy. A couple years ago, we wrote a paper, a blog, I guess, on this IGC website, me and the 2 colleagues there, around the shared resource of hydro or water in South Asia. So all the borders with India to Bangladesh, to Nepal, to different places, Pakistan, that have, long histories of conflict with each other, and how that worked. And interestingly, I find it really interesting. I don't know this guy, but we wrote this paper together. His name, you see there, is Mr. Ravinder. And it's like Beyonce, in as much as his name is just Ravinder, because I believe he's taken off his surname because it was too easy to make a case that he was for either India or Pakistan based on his surname. And you would have lots of situations where in Ireland, they can tell if you're from the North or from the Republic in about 2 seconds by your haircut or your name or anything. It's unbelievable. I mean, I couldn't do it when I was there, but Bryan certainly can. So we looked at some of these shared resources and borders, and how some agreements could be made on shared resources without them being fully formed political alliances in place. So that remains the case. Another vector of this, or contour of this, is what happens in humanitarian settings. So humanitarian settings here, I'm roughly saying in refugee camps or in peri-urban slums or urban slums. Energy services have become, have always been an important part of providing decent lives for those who are in these situations. Now we have even more so in the news about victims of severe weather, things like that happened in Puerto Rico as a recent and good example. And so we've done some writing on that. Are there the key word in DC these days is resilient energy systems. What aspect of them is resilient? How do renewables play a role in the security aspects? And you see in Jordan, they opened a huge, or not huge, but for a refugee camp, a really big solar park and a PV park. And that became big news. So the UNHCR primarily is interested in this. And now there's an initiative called the Moving Energy Initiative, MEI, that's run out of Chatham House. Chatham House is the CSIS of the UK. Do you notice how I didn't say Brookings there? Yeah. One other aspect we've been writing about recently is as we move in this energy transition, what are the impacts for minerals and metals? So that means, if we're going to have tons of batteries and tons of photovoltaic systems based on any different kind of chemistries that are there, what impacts will these have on mineral and metal markets? And so you can think of everything from copper, which is in every motor and every motor, and the transmission systems, distribution systems, established markets, liquid markets, clear players, to things that are not so clear, like the market for cobalt. And cobalt, as we've seen in the news recently, is mostly coming out of the DRC Congo. Congo ranks very low on any metric of governance. There's also lots of conflict that has been in the country for a long time, and it currently dominates the market for cobalt. There's also all kinds of interesting other things that are happening. You get cobalt usually if you're mining nickel. The market for nickel has changed dramatically because the Chinese have changed some of the processes for getting pig nickel, I think is the term. And so that has onward effects for the cobalt market. And since energy is currently a small player or small demand for some of these markets, other things influence the market. So there's all sorts of different interesting things happening. But it turns out that some of them, not all of them, but some of them are happening in places where you have a lot of conflict. So, do you need to take lessons from conflict, diamond markets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? There's all kinds of stuff. So I'm just going to give you a couple case studies here. So you can see I'm just giving a little tour, an incomplete tour of this issue, and then Brian's going to talk more about what one country looks like in a post-conflict situation. The World Bank has been working in Afghanistan for some time. The president of Afghanistan is a former World Banker. We are working with them. The World Bank is working with them on energy planning, on rural access, on resilient systems, et cetera. And it is very difficult to do investment projects and projects in general in Afghanistan, as you can imagine. It's very hard to put staff there. Over the last couple of years, there's been, of course, lots of bombings and death. And of course, the people in Afghanistan are very taken with the need to have energy services and energy systems, just like they are for water and water services. And so we're trying to help them. One of the ways we did it was doing some energy planning using GIS systems, demographic systems, and this is now live on the web at the World Bank. We did some of that modeling, and we took into consideration aspects of risk for these systems. So if you, and I'll go into this a little bit, but if you take an energy system like Afghanistan and you model it with a mathematical model the same way we know how to do, which is an objective function least cost model. That means the math algorithm, you tell the math algorithm to find the least cost, right? The math, as the people from the EIA and others in here would tell you, is agnostic to the location, right? The math just solves. So in some way, if you took the same algorithm for Connecticut or Afghanistan, it will give you very similar, based on resources and demographics. It's going to give you a very similar answer. And what it tends to say is, and this is the case, and I'll show you in South Sudan, is build a huge power plant with the resource that you have at the cheapest, and then transmit the energy to somewhere else. And I'm going to go over this for South Sudan, but we tried to take this into consideration in Afghanistan as well, and looked at the demographics of the place and some of the risk elements, although we didn't go too far with that. I just put this up because, of course, the U.S. government is terribly active in Afghanistan and has for a long time, and no one has an answer to how it works. But the CGAR, which is a U.S. government operation, Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, they took some of our thoughts on power system planning and energy and put it in their, I don't know what it is, a newsletter, a magazine, but it was really interesting to us because I didn't talk to them before they did this, and they're obviously taken with those issues. So what I was saying about traditional least cost planning, that's the kind of generic power system planning at a abstract level before you get into technical things like load flows and things, does is it looks for the least cost based on resources and technology, et cetera. So what we said in South Sudan was, well, what if you tried to think about the risks or uncertainties posed by conflict states? Is there a way to influence the math to give you a different kind of answer? And of course, you're not going to influence the math per se, but you can do stuff. And so what we saw was, if you made the regular assumptions in South Sudan, then you would build a big countrywide transmission system that ran at perfect frequency. The reality is that here's what the USAID and US State Department say about the areas of issues in South Sudan. In other words, they're all over the place. And even if we looked here, this is an assumption about this. This is not really, this isn't sort of fair, this language, but this is the reality of the solar resource in Nigeria, the red being more, the blue being less. And here's the issues of conflict in Nigeria, the north. So they happen to be correlated. So, if the mathematical model would tell you build a ton of photovoltaic plants here, right? The violence stuff would tell you, well, that's going to be pretty hard to do. Or it's going to cost a heck of a lot more, right? So here's the South Sudan example. We tweaked some of the math and we said, here, put some higher numbers on risk for investment in X, Y, and Z. What we did was the larger scale the project by 100 megawatts, we just added risk to it. This is a very simplistic way to do it. But what you see is essentially this isn't totally fair either, but this is an abstracted thing that just says the solar cost, and I'm sorry about that, the solar cost is going to stay the same, but if you start to add some risk to the scale of these other technologies, they're going to start to go up. That's all it says. And what we have now with, Joe's not here, colleagues from North Carolina State and colleagues for Johns Hopkins are both doing much more sophisticated mathematical modeling, stochastic modeling, fancy modeling that young people can do. And those papers are coming out imminently. So one's under submission now and the other one's about to be. They turn out to give us pretty similar kinds of answers. In other words, you want systems that are more resilient, smaller scale. Mini grids come out looking pretty good under some of these assumptions, and those papers will be out soon. I'll send them over to Sarah. I say here, and Brian's going to do this. This is just a word on Ireland, but I'll just do this piece, Brian, because here's a map of the island of Ireland. The dark gray is Northern Ireland. It's part of the United Kingdom. The south is the country of Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. And since in the last several years, there's both infrastructure and markets for electricity and sort of for natural gas that go across the island. And that was not feasible prior to peace. that being said, these issues, even in a post-conflict place like Ireland, that's well post-conflict by all accounts, especially as compared to Afghanistan or South Sudan, still needs monitoring, and those kind of monitoring exists at the National Energy Agency there. And finally, thanks again, Sarah, for having me, and happy St. Patrick's Day.
Thank you, Sarah, for inviting me. So I'm going to continue on, as has been said, focusing in a particular kind of case study, if you like, focusing on Ireland. Just to get a sense of the audience, how many people here have Irish roots, heritage? Okay, interesting. This is an interesting presentation for me because it's putting me out of my comfort zone. I normally do work on kind of looking into the future and energy scenario analysis, and at a global, European and national scale, and comparing notes then with some of the analysis that Morgan is doing, that Dave is doing, and that others are doing in terms of where we're going into the future in energy. And in this one, I'm bringing in a bit of history and a bit of politics, and I'm not an expert in either of these. So bear with me on those aspects as you kind of listen to this presentation. But I do think it's a fascinating topic, and I was delighted at the opportunity to discuss it, particularly in this the week of St. Patrick's Day. Earlier today, I was at an event. We have a long tradition going back to John F. Kennedy of the Irish Prime Minister of the day coming over on St. Patrick's Day and meeting with the US President, and that continues to the present day. And then more recently, there was a business angle added to the political event, and even more recently, a scientific angle. So this morning, we were at an event on some of the collaboration between the US and Ireland on science and engineering. And we talked about some of the work we're doing in collaboration with the Freedom Centre, which is funded by the National Science Foundation, and ourselves at MaREI, funded by the Science Foundation Ireland. So these collaborations are very important, and we're delighted at the opportunity to collaborate directly with institutes in the United States. As Sarah mentioned, I've many logos. I'm based in University College Cork. And we have an environmental research institute within the university, but we also manage this national centre, MaREI, from UCC. So I'll give you a kind of a heads up on some of the highlights of this presentation. I'm going to take you right back 800 years. We have songs about 800 years of British rule, and that takes us up to the period of the late 1960s, where there was civil rights movements in large parts of the world and in Northern Ireland as well. And then we had effectively this 30-year period that we euphemistically call the Troubles, and that continued up to 1998. Since then, we've had the peace process. Effectively, the Good Friday Agreement was signed in April 10th, 1998, and we're celebrating the 20-year anniversary of that. So a lot of this focuses on kind of the 30 years of the Troubles and then the 20 years subsequently of the peace process. And through the lens of the energy infrastructure and energy markets, we do have an electricity interconnector between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland that was built in 1970 and subsequently bombed for a number of years, and effectively out of commission for 20 years, reinstated then as the peace process emerged. And interestingly, energy was not named as one of the kind of topic areas for the Good Friday Agreement, which is the agreement surrounding the peace process, essentially. But partly because of that, in my view, a lot of things were able to happen under the radar successfully. And the development, in particular, of a single electricity market, one of the first, I understand, in the world in terms of how it's structured, and gas pipeline development, and more recently then a second electricity interconnector approved. So this is a kind of largely a 50-year story of the challenges of energy through the eyes of a conflict, and then, or through the lens of a conflict, and then how that can develop in a post-conflict situation. Just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from, the focus of our centre, we've got 200 researchers in Ireland focusing on topics in the marine and in the energy space, and effectively trying to assist Ireland's energy transition. We have a number of industry partners. That's a very key part of the Science Foundation Ireland funding model, similar to National Science Foundation here, and about $66 million in terms of funding over a 6-year period. So that's Ireland, the small green shaded area there. And in terms of scale, what you see here is the colour coding. So the island of Ireland was split into Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland in 1921. And effectively, the Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales and England is collectively the United Kingdom, and Scotland, Wales and England is collectively Great Britain. And just to show up some numbers in terms of where we are in terms of population, or how that might compare. Now, these are states rather than, it's not talking about Washington, it's not DC here, it's the state of Washington. But roughly speaking, we're talking about the scale in population terms of some of these states in the US, just to give a bit of context. Now, a bit of historical context in terms of timeline to this period, this 30-year period known as the Troubles. So we had this invasion leading to, and that marks this 800 years of British rule. We've had a number of kind of wars and sort of rebellions against that. But a particular thing happened at the end of 1607, where a lot of the leadership we were effectively tribal, so we couldn't deal with a single country army significantly. And in fact, when the British came over, they sided with some earls against other earls, so we were in a weakened situation. But the graph shows sort of the plantation of Ireland, and this is where effectively settlers came over from Britain. And this helps to explain why Northern Ireland remained as part of the UK afterwards, because it was a significant focus of the plantations in that period. The conflict in Ireland is sometimes referred to as a religious conflict, and this is why. I mean, really, it's a power struggle, and it was about land ownership. It was about rights to and control, and effectively, if you look at the quote at the bottom right from Oliver Cromwell when he came over, and these enactment of what were called collectively penal laws, which kind of dispossessed the largely Catholic population. You can see why it transferred, if you like, into being simply characterized as a kind of a conflict between Protestants and Catholics. The orange and the mural on the left-hand side is significant as well, associated with the Orange Order. And effectively, the Irish tricolour, the green, white and gold flag, I mean, the gold represents this Orange Order. The green represents the more traditional Irish, and the white is kind of representing peace in the middle. So that's where the flag comes from. But we were formally joined in 1800 with these Acts of Union, which effectively the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And that situation was resisted by Irish people over different times, but we had this particular commemoration in 2016 of 100 years of the Easter Rising. The interesting thing about the Easter Rising was it wasn't a very popular event. But what happened was afterwards, the British forces executed the leadership, and that really annoyed people, and that really rallied a kind of an increase in resistance. We also had a situation where a lot of the people who were involved in that conflict were then taken and put into the same camp in Britain, so it became a training camp, and they exchanged political ideas, did some military training. So effectively, that led to a an emergence of a possibility of a war of independence. We also had people coming back from World War I who were trained in military affairs. It was largely a guerrilla workforce, guerrilla forces, as you can see on the bottom right there. And in 1921, then there was a truce, and this act that established Northern Ireland as a statelet, if you like, and the rest of Ireland being the Free State and subsequently Republic of Ireland. And a lot of people resisted that, and some people were in favour of that, and that's what led to a civil war. And as you know yourselves from the United States, civil wars are not things that are easily overcome. So that gives a bit of a historical context leading up to this period that we refer to as the Troubles. And effectively, in 1968, in Derry, I think it was the 5th of October, there was a civil rights march, and it met with brutality from the police. And this is typically referred to as the day the Troubles began. The army came in and initially separating the forces that were fighting with each other, including, protecting Catholics from the police initially. So it was a strange kind of setup. But then the British Army shot 13 people on Bloody Sunday, and that essentially mobilised a lot of support for people to join the paramilitary organisation, the IRA, which responded sometime later with 28 bombs on one day, killing 9 people, became known as Bloody Friday. There was a ceasefire then in 1994, and this is what paved the way for effectively the peace process. And we had President Clinton came over. That was an interesting move, actually, because at that time, Britain was of the opinion that there shouldn't be a head of state coming from America to Northern Ireland, because effectively it was an internal matter for Great Britain. So it was an interesting move when President Clinton came and effectively lent his support to the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process, essentially. So again, that gives a very simplistic, crude overview of the Troubles, that 30-year period. In terms of what happened then on the energy side, particular pieces of infrastructure were targeted by the Ulster Volunteer Force, is one of the loyalist paramilitary organisations. So essentially, if you want to read that as Protestant, feel free if it's simpler. And then the IRA represents the Republicans or the Catholics. But effectively, the loyalists who were loyal to the British Crown didn't want any engagement with the South in terms of the collaboration between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, because they saw it as potentially impacting on the relationship between Northern Ireland and Britain. So, and the IRA didn't recognise Northern Ireland as a legitimate state, so both of them had different reasons for targeting the interconnector, which was built in 1970, subsequently bombed a number of times, and then decommissioned in 1975. So and that put an end to the infrastructure, or pause for the infrastructure, for the remaining 20 years or so of the Troubles. Now, subsequently then, with the Good Friday Agreement, there were a number of topics that were agreed. So these were the areas for North-South post-conflict focus. And one of the things you'll notice from this list is that energy is not mentioned as a specific topic. Some of these topics made more progress than others. Some of them were very politically contentious, so integrated education, for example, areas around security was dealt with a bit separately, but even issues around health, etc. So there was a number of areas there that were contentious, and some areas made more progress than others. But generally, they were used at different times as political footballs. So rather than making progress to make a political statement, there was resistance to cooperation. And the North-South Ministerial Council, again, energy is notably absent. And I'm not quite sure why energy was left out. But the interesting thing is that an All-Ireland energy market development framework was developed. So the Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland came together to look towards how to develop improved infrastructure and improved markets on the energy side. And this largely came from European Union policy rather than anything to do with directly with the British, Irish, Northern Irish policy. So it was quite an interesting way in which energy could be, there could be collaboration on energy under using the EU policy that Ireland, Northern Ireland and Great Britain are all part of, and at the same time, even though it wasn't mentioned in the North-South collaboration focus coming out of the Good Friday Agreement. And my own view, my own naive view, is that's one of the reasons that it actually worked better, because it didn't have that political baggage. So progress was made very significantly, establishing this electricity trading arrangement, establishing All-Ireland gas market, establishing interconnection. It's like, in terms of a 20-year period, what's been achieved is very significant. So the electricity interconnector was restored in 1995. 6 years later, there was an interconnector between Northern Ireland and Scotland established. There was a second gas pipeline between Scotland and Ireland in 2002, a north-south gas pipeline in 2006, the All-Ireland single electricity market in 2007, etc., etc. So you had the ones in bold are associated with electricity and the others associated with gas. But this is a phenomenal, in terms of post-conflict establishment of energy infrastructure and energy markets. I don't know of any other example like this in terms of the pace at which progress was made. And this is a kind of separate piece of work we've done in looking at again, thinking of this 100 years since 1916. We traced the development of electricity infrastructure, and that's a paper that was published. And we were looking at different times the policy, what happened in policy terms around energy security, around laterally environment and climate change, but looking at the story or a historical perspective through the lens of energy infrastructure. And one thing that jumps out is, this just shows a snapshot of the electricity system in 1930, which was very crude and limited. And one of the first, like the Irish state got independence in 1921. We built a transmission system and a large hydropower station in Ordnacrusha, which is, you can trace back in terms of, it's a central point from which that power system comes out of, just down around here. And essentially, you had the establishment of the electricity system was one of the first very ambitious things we did post-independence. And if you look, at the level now in 2016 of infrastructure, both in Northern Ireland, but also in terms of the north-south infrastructure, you can see that things have moved on very significantly. And just zooming in on that, the main, and this is a synchronous connection in terms of the one on the bottom right there. There's two small tie lines as well at other parts of along the border. And then more recently, we have this second interconnector that's planned. And again, there's another interesting story associated with that has a long checkered history in terms of that proposed second interconnector, but it was approved very recently on the Northern Ireland side. So another, I suppose, significant piece of infrastructure, which is essentially needed, and that's what's shown by this analysis here. We looked at, or AirGrid, the transmission system operator, has done some analysis on what the situation is in terms of generation adequacy, if we look at it from the point of view of the Republic of Ireland, which is the yellow, the All-Island Network, which is the purple, or the bottom line, which is Northern Ireland. So in the absence of the interconnector, the second interconnector, you can see that there's a likely deficit arriving for Northern Ireland post-2020. So the second interconnector, while it might be politically acceptable still to some of the parties up there, it's essential in terms of meeting the electricity service requirements. And this is a challenge and Morgan has pointed this, where politics meets with energy infrastructure. It can be an enabler or it can be a challenge to prosperity and to addressing conflict. And if you look at it, sort of taking the telescope out a bit, you can see that more broadly, we're now looking at also the second interconnector is shown there between the north-south interconnector. The first one isn't shown, but just the second one there. And also we're looking at possible interconnector to France and other interconnection developments you can see there as well. So effectively, what we've seen is, as I say, we had this contextual piece that I brought you through just to explain maybe in very crude and brief terms where that 30-year period of the Troubles came from, and also then why the electricity interconnector was targeted. But then in the post-conflict period that we've just have had a very significant, rapid pace of progress, which has helped in terms of North-South relations, but also in terms of course, economic development and growth in both regions. So thank you very much. And I meant to say happy, not just St. Patrick's Day, but you mentioned there's a Pi Day, is it as well? Thank you.
Thank you. It's very equitable of you to remember both holidays, so thank you. And it's Adam's birthday. So happy birthday, Adam Szyminski, 3 holidays. Okay, that was great. So a couple questions that I want to just sort of pull out from there before we turn to the audience for questions. Bryan, you have made an observation or an assertion that keeping electricity out of the post-conflict resolution environment was helpful because it was a technical issue and it didn't get over-politicized and all that sort of thing. I want to investigate that from 2 different perspectives. One, Morgan, in your experience, do you agree? You had sort of said if you're going to map out the proper electricity system, it's not going to be a large integrated system. It'll be maybe more microgrids and more distributed. But in your experience, especially from the World Bank, I have heard many times there's a different perspective, which is everybody's going to want better electricity access, and therefore it's something that everyone can get behind, and therefore it can be a positive force. Any more thoughts on that, maybe from you, Morgan, and then from you, Bryan? Do you think it actually was part of the dialogue, but it just wasn't a discrete part of it? So, for example, economic growth and resilience was one part. Could it have come in through that channel where people are saying, great, if you want us to attract new business or to grow, we need a more robust electricity system?
Sure, thanks, Sarah. Great question. I would just point out that I arrived in Ireland in 2002, and most of those good things happened directly after that. So
I'd like to thank Morgan for that.
Thank you. It was a really exciting time to show up in Ireland because as I arrived, the development of the all-island electricity market especially was at a nascent phase, and watching it build from largely technical discussions around how to shape the market, what kind of market, detailed questions about locational marginal pricing and transmission congestion tended to be the topic of the day rather than was there an issue in the market clearing in British pounds and Irish or in euro. So that was pretty refreshing and very technical. And so I agree with, and Bryan and I have talked about this obviously, that in the case of Ireland, it seems to be the case that by just going ahead with technical studies and the assumption that, well, everyone wanted decent electricity service, that it went ahead, possibly better as a result. I think in other countries, some of the borders we've been thinking about, say between India and Pakistan, between Israel and Palestine, between South Sudan and Sudan, and within countries like Afghanistan, it may be the case that the energy, the requirement or the desire for good energy services is a preemptive way to pull in the political process, so a different phase. But it remains to be seen, I guess, and each situation is obviously very different. And I think that's probably, even though a cliche, important to say that each of those cases I just mentioned are radically different in terms of politics, resources, and the rest of it, and the history. So it's lovely to go back the 800 years, because if you tried to do that in some of the other regions, you would get equally complicated or possibly much more complicated pictures. So.
Firstly, the assertion I made was very much I think to answer it correctly, like whether leaving it out was the thing that made it possible, I think that would need kind of political scientific analysis. I'm just looking at what happened. It was left out and it progressed very well, And anecdotally then, talking to some of the people that were involved, it was seen to not have the same baggage as some of the other areas. One thing I did forget to mention towards the end, which is very important, is that it's now thrown into a huge uncertainty because of Brexit. And the interesting thing is, like in after 800 years or even 30 years of the Troubles, to be able to so quickly move to a single electricity market is to my mind, a phenomenal achievement. The issues around Brexit are very complex. They're very difficult. But I'm not convinced that the implications on this progress that has been made on the electricity and gas side, I'm not convinced that they're certainly not publicly getting the attention that they deserve in terms of the risk it poses to the progress that has been made there. So it starts to throw in a huge amount of uncertainty. And just on a personal level, I visited Northern Ireland last summer, and while it is 20 years of the peace process that's being celebrated this year, and it's phenomenal, the tensions are still very, it's 20 years is a very short time, so I think like it's not only the energy system that the Brexit challenges, if you like, or the progress in the energy system, but politically as well. I think it's a very bad time to have that kind of uncertainty, I think. Thank you.
Maybe just to ask you one follow-up question for that, which is, so in thinking about the ability of energy to help with political reconciliation, that's sort of what we've been talking about so far. But since, and you're just touching on this, so I want to pull it out a little bit, is since that time, has the creation of a single energy market created additional political reconciliation, right? Is there now a constituent set of interests in Ireland that are on the side of keeping the electric power system working, from the business community, from the electric, and that will help if political tension resulting from Brexit, do you now have a new constituency base that you didn't have before because of the collective market?
I think that's definitely the case, certainly from my experience. Again, it's largely, though, anecdotal. I haven't researched that in detail, but talking to people who are involved on the technical aspects, as Morgan said, generally they would have started with looking at solving a technical problem and then seeing the benefits that it does actually deliver in terms of energy services. So they become not so much politicized, but they become aware of some of the issues, if you like, and the dialogue that happened north and south as well on those topics, I think, has been very beneficial for the reconciliation and process. So I think that certainly is the case, that you had this kind of an indirect impact of how it supports the process, just from the fact that people are talking about energy, but actually then seeing how it can not rise above, but it can be talked about without going into the political challenging parts, if you like. And I would certainly hope that Brexit doesn't impact, and there is now that constituency. I mean, this just makes sense, So it's and that common sense thing is I think a great input into kind of policy and political processes.
I think we experience a little bit of that here with NAFTA, right? NAFTA was a creation, and now you have to, in undoing or modernizing it, you have to go against a constituency set of interests who now think, well, hold on, the vast majority of my trade is with Mexico and these products and goods and services. I need to protect that sort of thing. So, Morgan, I wanted to ask you, in our work, a lot of times, and I know you've been thinking about this as well, electricity is thought about geostrategically in a much different way than things like oil and gas. Electricity sometimes is thought as that thing that people just want to have show up, and therefore it's benign and good and everyone agrees on it, whereas oil and gas is quite different. Has that been your experience, particularly in the way in which institutions like the World Bank, or even academic institutions that think about these types of issues, deal with the role of oil and gas in conflict zones as opposed to electricity?
That's a great question. So I agree with the first part. I won't be quite as couched. Bryan's a good academic, and so he's so balanced in his study of these things. Yes, look, they're very different markets. They're different kinds of systems. Interestingly, I think if we take the case of Ireland, it's again useful in that regard. So the electricity market came first, the all-island electricity market, and at the same time there remains considerable issues around the security of supply for things like gas, and you've had many sessions here discussing the validity of Nord Stream 2, or back in the day, the precursor of Nord Stream, and what the Southern Gas Corridor is going to do, et cetera, to diversity of supply vis-a-vis Russia, Ukraine, and the European Union. Now, Ireland was on the sharp edge of some of those issues. It's not usually talked about in the U.S. Discussion of it, but Ireland is literally at the end of those gas pipelines, right? And so in 2006 and 2008 or 9, Ireland was deeply engaged in discussions in Brussels between Russia and the Ukraine and those parties in the European Union, et cetera, because of that exposure. And then there was exposure because we were at the end of the line, but the people that were just before us at the end of the line was the United Kingdom, right? So that was a very different set and an unresolved set. But on the island itself, the gas operator, the gas infrastructure and market is functioning fairly seamlessly. So I think there are ways to make it work also.
So one more question, and then I'll open it up to folks to ask some questions. Bryan, could you talk a little bit about you said you're uncomfortable with the looking back thing, so we'll put you back into your comfort zone. Looking forward towards Ireland's energy goals and for a more sustainable system and all of those sorts of things, how does the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland work together towards those ends? And is there area for them to do that better and in improved ways?
Sorry, one way in which that's happening is kind of where possible sharing targets, for example. So I mean, if we want to have 40% of our electricity from renewable sources, and if they choose 40%, well then it kind of, it helps, given that we've the single electricity market. And but of course then, because they're different jurisdictions, the subsidy rates are different, and so it gets tricky. And again, in the context of Brexit, like we're all currently in the European Union frameworks for those things, so we share certain ambitions in that regard. So so that's one area. In terms of we would have different ambitions in terms of broadly things around emission reductions and how much, you know, this willingness to pay. It's interesting. I'll digress with the example of Scotland. I was doing some work helping the Scottish government develop an energy system modelling capability. And one thing that struck me there was that their emissions ambition was very strong, you know, stronger than England, stronger than Wales, stronger than the overall UK ambition. And it was a kind of point of principle and a point of pride for them, even though a lot of the you know, taxation and issues that impact on their ability to achieve the targets are, you know, decided for the UK as a whole. And that was quite a striking example. Within Northern Ireland, there isn't the same kind of energy system modelling capability. We're currently putting in a proposal with colleagues in University College London to look at Ireland, the UK, in the context of Europe, to help try and understand and tease out, if we have different ambitions, what will that mean? Both in terms of our individual but also collective abilities to meet targets, etc., and within the European context. So, so I'll probably be better placed to answer that question more fully in about 2 years. But I think it's a very interesting point, and it kind of shows essentially where, I mean, if we have a single electricity market, it does suggest that maybe we should have shared ambitions in other areas. So you get this kind of chicken and egg effect. And it doesn't always mean it's going to happen, but it does leverage some kind of, you know, rationality into that discussion, you know, of sharing ambition in other areas.
Sure. Okay, if you've got a question, please wait for the microphone, state your name and affiliation, and question in the form of a question. We will start here and then go there.
Hello, thank you very much for the conversation today. My name is Jill Baggerman, and I'm a graduate student and research fellow. And I'm doing research on how energy and water resources are used as proxies during war, and then also can be used during the peace process. And so for you, I'm very interested in how those kind of social issues, especially in the places I've been looking, including Iraq and Syria, there is a number of correlations that I'm preliminary finding about historical discrimination and political marginalization correlating with energy and water inaccess. And so I'm curious if that comes up in any of your risk analysis or the modeling that you do. And then for you, I'm very curious, in the early maps, there was almost no energy infrastructure in Northern Ireland, if any. And so I'm curious if that is a proxy for power dynamics and to what extent that played up in the peace processes.
That's a good question. And I was doing some checking on because in the first map, the border is there, so I'm not sure if that map suggests just the infrastructure south of the border and didn't include infrastructure north of the border. Certainly in terms of the power plants that are there now, I think the first one was built in the 1940s in Northern Ireland. But I presume they probably had some kind of mini-grid, small systems before then. And what was striking in terms of preparing for this, I mean, I like the fact that the interconnector was only built in 1970. I thought was interesting, you know, and I was wondering was probably too, because it was just before the first oil crisis essentially. So it's kind of it's just interesting, but I'm not quite sure of the. So there's some parts of the story that I don't fully understand the detail of. But in answer to your question, I would assume there was some infrastructure there prior to the 1940s. Probably, like ours was quite crude. I'm sure theirs was quite crude as well. But certainly in terms of industrialization, there would have been a faster industrialization within Northern Ireland rather than in the Republic of Ireland. So I would suspect that their infrastructure was probably ahead of ours, even though it wasn't shown in that map.
I don't have a great answer for you. The two things as far as the modeling goes is the World Bank has an initiative called the Thirsty Energy Initiative that's done two principal pieces of work, right? One hasn't been released yet, but it should be imminent as far as I know. But one was on the Republic of South Africa. So some of the issues you're talking about may have been covered there, but it mostly took a traditional energy model, a partial equilibrium model, and added water constraints to it. So in addition to the other things, we added some water constraints. That hasn't been done so many times before in these energy models. It's been done. In fact, it's been done in the United States, but we did a national model with Gary Goldstein and them. So it's a pretty rigorous, interesting piece of work, and it shows some of the areas where it's weak and where it's strong, but it doesn't pick out the areas of, say, social problems, or it doesn't talk about areas of post-apartheid or any of those kind of things. So it takes what the South Africans call their integrated resource model and adds water to it. We did the same for China, but it was a much different exercise, as you might imagine, a much different country. China has countless energy models and data issues, et cetera, et cetera. So it's going to be a very different report. So that's one thing. The other thing I would say is that that I mentioned the Moving Energy Initiative, which is out of Chatham House, which deals specifically with refugee camps and the migration of people because of violence. So it deals somewhat with urban slums as well. In that work, the energy and water services are sometimes treated the same. But as you imagine, or as you're learning, or as you know, there's energy people and water people, and the two shall never meet. They're both terribly complex sectors, and it's hard. I think, to be fair, it's just hard for human beings to capture that amount of complexities in their brains. There are some people working on it, but I don't have anything more for you on that.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for the conference. My name is Sergio Martinez, and I'm working with the 3IE Impact. And previously, I worked in energy research for Latin American and Inter-American dialogue. So I have a question about the legal frameworks and multi-stakeholder mechanisms for dialogue when it comes with investment in electricity projects in fragile states. So to give you a brief example, in Colombia, less than 3% of people that live without access to electricity, they actually live in places that are controlled by the FARC, which is the armed groups in the country. And some of the solutions is about creating regulations that facilitate small-scale power producers to sell electricity back to the grid. So I'm wondering how the World Bank or these multilateral organizations can incorporate an approach, maybe a bottom-up approach, to incorporate this kind of legislative or institutional dynamics in order to assess risk mitigation. Thank you.
Well, I do not speak on behalf of the World Bank or the other multilaterals, but The issue that you bring up is an important one. In other words, that these political processes are likewise very complicated along with the technical aspects. And, you know, in the case of the World Bank, the loans and the risk mitigation instruments are sovereign, right? They're negotiated to national governments. Sometimes they can be negotiated with regional governments or localities, but it's always through a sovereign state. And so it becomes difficult to take into consideration the kind of example you gave there. In other words, the loans to the government of Colombia that exist now are with the government of Colombia. And so some of those political complexities and fragile things are going to have to get more detailed and more complicated, but at this point, I'm not sure of what mechanism there is for that outside of, say, disaster risk bonds and things like that, and specific investments for, say, mini grids in fragile states or something like that at a province or sub-state level. But I'm not sure how much it's taken into consideration or able to be taken into consideration now.
On the sort of like stakeholder engagement side of things, I can imagine that development institutions that are going to grant that kind of agreement with a sovereign state can dictate a little bit of the terms of stakeholder engagement that goes into whatever the arrangement is, or has that been not successful?
No, I'm just not sure. I mean, at some level, the multilaterals discuss things in different ways. So the way the IMF does business is very different than how the World Bank does business, as an example. And so, as you can imagine, when the IMF goes into a country, there is a different set of stakeholder discussions than when the bank comes in typically at a sector level, right? Rather than the macroeconomy, there's sector level discussions. And those I think there's plenty of discussions that take place either from the groups at the bank, like the fragile and conflict, there's a group, right? So that they do that kind of work. But if you talk about, say the infrastructure side, so the water group or the energy group or the agriculture group or the forestry group, those are pillars and how the bank is now done are different. They're also different by technology, right, or by source. And so the work, say, on natural gas and oil tends to be around stakeholder engagement and framing governance and legal governance wraps, as I call them, where in electricity it tends to be, while there's some sector reform processes, there's also just a lot of projects to invest in project A or B. So it varies, as you can imagine, but that's a great question.
On another conference that we had, a workshop, what was interesting is we were trying to think about both in conflict areas and just in places where additional investment in infrastructure was needed. Some of the groups that were in the room talking from a development perspective said it's actually really helpful to their cause if there's civil society voices that are pushing for those things. It's something that they're politically really not able to go off and say, hey, we'd like this to happen, or to engage in, but it's really helpful, particularly in the area of subsidy reform. You know, if there's a broader understanding within a community that energy subsidies can be utilized, subsidies can be distributed differently within an economy than through energy, it's really helpful for them in terms of things that they're trying to get done.
Just to come in that, there's countries in conflict and there's countries in conflict. So that kind of discussion doesn't tend to happen in Afghanistan or South Sudan, right? And so some of the projects in, say, Afghanistan have to do with these processes that are negotiated well outside of the World Bank by the United States and other governments around, you know, getting services to women or getting services to specific areas that are done in a very different multilateral space than the international financial institutions. As you can imagine, the same goes for South Sudan. There is no discussion of say, subsidy reform. There's just trying to keep people alive, right?
Yes, sir.
I'm Tom Bowen from USAID, and I have a question. If I could put it in the context of a conflict, conflict analysis and infrastructure, but it'd be great to get some feedback from both Morgan and Bryan on this, because I know our discussion mostly this afternoon has been on more of the post-conflict, but if we're talking about an active insurgency, and we're talking about provision of energy to a populace, increasing energy access, and just, for example, in Afghanistan, as Morgan well knows, it would be, unless you're in Metro Kabul, it would be difficult to have an major energy program without what we refer to as spillage to elements of the insurgency. So my question is there any empirical evidence to suggest that during an insurgency, and perhaps taking a long view over years, as you increase the level of access to affordable, cheap, reliable electricity, does that add support to insurgencies? Does it add fuel to the fire of an insurgency? Or does, over time, and again, taking the long view, does that open up, are there new dynamics relative to alternative livelihoods, et cetera, and other dynamics within governance and economic growth that over time is there a waning support for an insurgency?
Great. I'm going to take one more because we only have 5 minutes left. So, did you have your hand up? And you have your hand up too? If you can be fast, we'll get them both in.
Hi there, Alex Gilbert from Spark Library. Straightforward question. Why is energy a potential source of conflict, a target during conflicts, and how does that impact the reconciliation process afterwards?
Just a quick question for Morgan. My name is Monique St. Jar from Power Africa. You mentioned a concrete kind of recommendation about overlaying conflict with energy sector planning and how that can lead you maybe more towards distributed energy solutions. Can you talk about how off-grid and microgrid technologies might alter how you go about electricity access in conflict zones?
Geez, that's a series of very easy questions, starting with I'll tick them off. For USAID, great question. I haven't seen any empirical studies, and I think, even you saw I used one of your maps up there for South Sudan. We were going into Afghanistan, when we were doing work in Afghanistan, and we were even trying to pick out some provinces to do studies on where actual polls could go. It's been hugely complicated by some of your maps and State Department maps, because even within the provinces, there's no shortage of high conflict zones in each one. And no, so we haven't even been able to find empirical studies of the sort of cost of these things to make these guesses on the risk, except for Hisham Zarefi did one nice paper where he looked at violence taking out power systems. But it's a great area for further work. Hi, Alex, nice to see you. Let me skip yours. Bryan can do yours. That was pretty good, huh? The mini-grid work, mini-grids or microgrids, I can't remember what people like to use right now, is the topic of the day in places like in the energy access sort of space, and Power Africa is well aware of them. I think we show their resilience in terms of scale mostly, and the lack of taking out or bombing of substations or transmission things. So that's how we model them, just because of the scale. But I think there's all kinds of economic benefits and things to, say, powering a capital city, or a series of so policy and regulation and the acts of government can actually take place. But Power Africa is doing some terrific work on this, I think, and there's some really interesting models emerging from places like Caterpillar, Cat Power, that you've seen, where they're building on the existing supply chains for diesel and then hybridizing their systems with, say, solar, right? And then you get sort of a benefit from both things, but really exciting. And Alex, I don't know why people pick on these things, but Bryan will know.
Thanks, Morgan. Just firstly on the USAID question, I mean, I'd agree with Morgan. I think it would make a great, if you have funding to put it up for a PhD scholarship in that area, I think would be very, very rich. Why is energy targeted? It depends on the conflict and who's doing the targeting. But I mean, if you want to kind of take the power away from a group, remove their telecommunications, remove energy, remove water supply. So that's one of the reasons. In terms of Northern Ireland, my sense of it is that there were different perspectives. I mean, what was interesting is that both sides, both the Loyalists and the Republicans, targeted the interconnector, but it was for different reasons. So from the Loyalists, it was a connection to the south, which is something that they wouldn't have been in favour of. And for the Republicans, I can only assume it's around this question of, you're battling against the recognition of this statelet as they saw it, and so destabilizing that was a good thing, in that logic. So it does make sense to me why energy would be targeted from those perspectives, but at the same time. Equally, when in a post-conflict, I mean, as I say, it was quite rapid how you can not get over that, but how you can see the benefit side of things as they accrue when you have better energy infrastructure. But the first part, I think, depends very much on the nature of the conflict.
Just to add to that, I think that there's some work that we did years ago looking at the differences of targeted infrastructure in various places and the reasons why pipelines in Colombia were targeted versus the energy infrastructure in Venezuela versus Nigeria. They're all very different, and the motivations are different, the causes are different, the effects are different, the impact you get on sort of the political wrangling is all very different. So it's actually a really interesting question. So, okay, well, we have reached 5 o'clock, and it has been wonderful to have both of you here to help celebrate St. Patrick's Day and Pi Day and Adam's birthday. And but I hope we can make this, and recognizing now that this is an annual event where really, really smart people from Ireland come and talk about energy in Washington. Hopefully, we can do it again next year. Maybe we'll talk about some of the really great things that Ireland is able to put forward in terms of its own energy transition. But please join me in thanking Morgan and Bryan for being here today.